Good morning, good thinkers. Well, it may not be morning for you, but it's morning for me here, 9 a.m. Pacific West Coast time of the US. But welcome if you're joining from anywhere in the world, 4 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time. Welcome to Good Thinking. Welcome, good thinkers. First of all, as always, let me know who you are and where you're from. We're going to have some fun today. Make it short and sweet, but we'll also make it fun and interactive. So hopefully you're here and ready just to quickly interact and give your input and play a little bit of brain bug bingo, which is also cognitive bias training, busting the assumptions that we make when we default to our lovely human brain, when we kind of turn on the default of our lovely human brains and default to using cognitive biases to make sense of the world. Welcome, Jennifer. Okay, she is ready. Okay, Jennifer is ready to win rubber chickens. Who else is ready to win rubber chickens? Let me know who you are and where you're from. Jawan is ready to win rubber chickens. Fantastic. Okay, I'm going to turn off this banner so I can see all of your comments a lot more clearly. All right, Sherry, welcome. And good morning, Hirsch from Budapest. And hello, Mr. Ding. Welcome from all over the world. Okay, ready, here we go. Oh, we got Michael from Toronto. We've got some really good thinkers in the house. This is going to be fun. Let's play some brain bug bingo. Are you ready? And Jawan is from Morocco. Fantastic. Okay, we've got some people ready to win some rubber chickens. So let's just get right into it. Let me give a little shout out. Oh, from Senegal. Okay, fantastic. Welcome from Senegal. I always have to welcome people on before we get started, but I'll get started, then I'll welcome some more people on. Anyway, be ready. All right, so how many of you, start with the first question. How many of you think cognitive biases are bad? We should wipe out our cognitive biases, and cognitive biases are bad. So just put bad or good. Okay, Jancy, good morning. Woo! I know where Jancy's from, Ventura, California, which I wish I was there hanging with you today, Jancy. All right, so how many of you think that cognitive biases are bad? Just bad. I know this is a little trick question. How many want to say bad, good, or how many of you want to say it depends? It depends. So let me know. And participation. Okay, so Michael says good. And we got it together. Sherry says no good. No good. Cognitive biases. So Michael says good. We've got one of each. Who wants to say it depends? It depends. Someone says no good. No bueno. Cognitive biases are bad. Jennifer says, aha. No, but we should be aware that we have them so we don't use them willy-nilly. Okay, I think I'm going to give that one. They're all great answers, but those get the raining rubber chickens. Raining rubber chickens for Jennifer's answer. And Mary says it can be tricky. Now, we talk a lot about cognitive biases, and then we also hear about implicit bias. And some of these terms get conflated. But at the core of we're going to talk about what is a cognitive bias. Okay, thank you for that great question. What is a cognitive bias? And Corey says it depends. And someone asked, what is a cognitive bias? So let's just get into that. There is a lot of evidence that our brains are more designed to keep stuff out than to keep stuff in. And that has to do with the fact that what we perceive is never all that there is. So we know that bloodhounds can smell massive amounts of things that we can't detect. We know bats can echolocate. We know that there are animals that can actually perceive more of the ultraviolet spectrum. So we know that there is a lot more out there that our brains as humans don't detect. And so our brains are pattern makers, okay? Our brains are pattern makers, and that's what they're designed to do. So cognitive biases actually can help us make quick patterns when we have quick decisions to make. Someone's running at us with an axe. We might think that they're wearing a forestry uniform. We might think, okay, they're going to chop down that tree before it falls on me or something like that. And someone runs at us with an axe. They're wearing a prison uniform. You might think, okay, I'm going to get out of the way. I don't want that axe to be like I don't chop off my head. All right. So that's a kind of a silly example, but we do make quick patterns all the time. Even when we're standing ready to cross the street, we look to see there's a car way down there. We know that this is a freeway. I'm not going to saunter across the street. There's a car down there. We know that this is a neighborhood. The car's probably not going 75 miles an hour. I can cross the street. So those are quick decisions that we make all the time. And as Barry says, hey, Barry, welcome, Barry. Cognitive biases are neither good nor bad, but without them, we wouldn't really be able to make patterns and make matches and make decisions for quick decisions. But with them, they can lead us astray. So at their core, they're semi-automatic mental processes, and they can act as optical illusions. And that's when they can lead us astray. So we're going to get into some of the most common cognitive biases that we use at Applied Curiosity Lab for one of our most fun things that we do, which is brain bug bingo. But I want to, and then we'll see if you guys, I'll give you scenarios after we go over some of these biases. Hi, happy to have you. I am so glad, Mr. Yan. I'm happy to have you here as well. All right, so the key isn't to be able to say, oh, I can name that cognitive bias, because that is knowing the name of things, which is great in the what to think realm. But since good thinking is about devoting some time to improving how we think, we're going to try to get to the understanding. Now, of course, the bingo, we go bingo when we have the name of a cognitive bias, but it's more important to understand when a cognitive bias might lead you astray. And then at the end, we'll go over a few key things that can help you check your cognitive biases that are super easy. Barry, thank you so much. Happy to attend. I'm so glad. And we've got Barry, great to see you too. Love all the good thinking. All right, so as cognitive simplifiers, we know that these cognitive biases help us make decisions fast and efficiently, but we should not rely on cognitive biases when we have more thoughtful, deliberate decisions. And that is quintessential and laid out in this great book, Daniel Kahneman's bestseller, Thinking Fast and Slow. A lot of people have it on their shelves. Fewer people have read it, but I highly recommend it. All right, so there is kind of a granddaddy of them all, or grandmother of them all, of all the cognitive biases. And a lot of people might call that one the confirmation bias, but I'm going to switch it around a little bit so we can reframe how we think about today. And I think the grandmother of all biases is the blind spot bias. And that is when we start learning about cognitive biases, we find it much easier to spot biases in other people than we find it then we're able to spot biases in ourselves. So an awareness of that blind spot bias is extremely pervasive. And I find it myself, I'm like, oh, that's just the confirmation bias. That's why you believe something different than me. And, we mentally accuse others of falling into bias traps or cognitive bias traps, when in fact, the most important exercise before we even start to think about other people is to try to identify it in ourselves. Actually, that's a hint at one of the little cues or clues that you can use to avoid letting cognitive biases lead you astray. So it's not so much about avoiding cognitive biases, right? It's about not allowing or preventing cognitive biases from leading you astray. All right. So we got the blind spot bias as the overall bias. So as we go through these biases really quickly so that we can get to the scenarios in the bingo, we'll start with confirmation bias. And a lot of you probably know confirmation bias. It's been in the news a lot lately. Some of you might not, because it has different names. So let's just make sure we're all talking about the same thing. So confirmation bias is the bias that makes us readily accept evidence that supports our pre-existing beliefs and discount evidence that doesn't. And it's really enticing, and it's very common. The point is not to see all the other people who have confirmation bias. The point is to identify when we might be susceptible ourselves, like me, myself, to confirmation bias. And it works in 3 ways. Ready? First of all, who has an example of confirmation bias? And I'll tell you the 3 ways it works. So if you have an example of confirmation bias, not that you see in other people, but that you see in yourself, let me know in the chat. That's a kind of a hard one, but let me know if you have something kind of to put into the chat. All right, here are the 3 ways. Number 1, we search for biased evidence. So when we go searching, we search for evidence that supports our pre-existing beliefs. And number 2, and we actually don't search for disconfirming evidence. So we kind of ignore disconfirming evidence and we search, and we have our favorite news sites, but we might not want to jump onto a news site that we have decided is, not true. Now, of course, there can be sites that are not only more biased, but actually less factual. But when you're trying to find a factual site that disconfirms, when we kind of do that, we see that all the time. All right, Kathy, yes. Kathy from Chicago, politicians play on it. Now, what about us? So the point here is to try to find out where we might be experiencing that so that we don't fall trapped to blind spot bias. But Kathy's right. Politicians all the time. The second way is that we interpret information in a biased way. So first, we seek information in a biased way. Second, we interpret information in a biased way. And third, we remember information in a biased way. So we seek, we interpret, and we remember all in a way that confirms our pre-existing beliefs and we ignore evidence rather that disconfirms our pre-existing beliefs. So confirmation bias, you can look out for it in those three ways. Again, seeking, interpreting, and remembering, right? Those are the three. Jennifer says, going to your own friends. Okay, excellent example. Going for your own friends, your silo of sameness for confirmation. And you hear this a lot with, I just want to be around like-minded people. Again, nothing wrong with that, but that's a hint that your confirmation bias may be afoot. All right, second bias. We're going to go quickly so we can get to the brain bug bingo. This is a very common one. This is the affect heuristic. And this is when we allow feelings of like and dislike to aid our decisions in ways that are irrelevant to whether we like or dislike. So instead of saying, is this person a good candidate for the job, we sneakily substitute, do I like this person? Or is Tesla a good investment? We sneakily substitute, ooh, I like Teslas. So whether you like Teslas or not really is not a good measure of whether Tesla is a good investment. Now, unless your investment strategy is to ignore the financial return and just invest in companies where you like their product, okay? But that's a different thing. So, that means that you have to be very clear about your intent and your decision and what you want for your decision outcome. So that's the affect heuristic, okay? Let's see, Barry says, I used to put a check on my gut reaction. Absolutely. I think we really there's a disservice when we say, always trust your gut, right? It really does ourselves a disservice because in some decisions, our gut or our intuition is brilliant, and in others, it is misleading. So I think that's great. Kathy says, yes. Okay, next one, anchoring bias. Okay, I think this anchoring bias is one of the most fun things, which means that we rely too heavily on the first piece of information offered or anchored when making decisions. And we'll do a little bit of a famous study. All right, here's my question. Do random anchors work, or do they have to be well thought out? Like, can a random number work on a completely irrelevant decision, or does it have to be well thought out? So question, rubber chickens for the right answer. Do random anchors work? Yes or no? Random anchors, yes or no? Let me know in the chat if you think random anchors work. All right. So an example, when you are making a purchase, you might hear, and you're negotiating something, you might hear, let's meet in the middle. When you are thinking to yourself, okay, I got offered this price, I offered this price, let's meet in the middle, that is a clear sign that the anchoring bias is afoot. How many of you have had that in your negotiation where you or someone you know said, let's meet in the middle? Okay, that's a sign. Uh-oh. All right, so here's my question for you. This is like the first pre-bingo question. You ready? All right, so do random anchors work? We've got a LinkedIn learner says no. We have got Corey says yes. And I have to say, excellent participation. And the answer is yes, random anchors work. And there's a very famous study, but I don't want to tell you yet because I want to ask a question before. So here's my question to you. And if you're from South America or from Peru, don't tell anyone the answer. And don't look it up on Google. So Barry says no, but sometimes random anchors can work as a guide. Actually, the answer is yes. Random anchors work in ways that will blow your mind. And yet our intuition is that that's not what drove our decision. But all the information in the lab says, like what Mr. Ding says, random anchors do work. All right. So is the population of Peru greater than or less than 50 million people? Just put it in the chat. Greater than or less than? Greater than or less than? Put it in the chat. Is the population of Peru greater than or less than 50 million people? Once you put that in, then I have a second question for you. But I want you to quickly put that in so I can ask the second question, which is, does anyone want to say greater than or equal to or greater than or less than 50 million people, the population of Peru? And I'm assuming you don't really know about the population of Peru. If you do, good for you, but you might that'll ruin the experiment. All right. So then you go ahead and guess greater than or equal to, or greater than or less than, rather, 50 million people. And then the second question, okay, so Andrew says less than, Michael says greater than, I think that's greater than. Okay, so we've got, I'm going to guess 50 million equal to 50 million. All right, so the next question is, what is the population of Peru? Okay, so now just put that in the chat. Just put it in the chat, and I'm going to keep going with a very, very famous experiment that is kind of one of the, and it's very replicated. So this is some of these cognitive bias experiments have had a problem with being able to be replicated. I will warn you. So always be skeptical. Always be skeptical that maybe it's working in different ways. So Mary Hannah says less than, but now tell us, excellent. Okay, so now tell us what is the population of Peru. All right, so here's the famous study. In 1974, Amos Tversky and Dan Kahneman, the kings of, I mean, Amos passed away before this book, but the kings of this, the grandfathers of behavioral economics, did a study where they asked a similar question. And they asked people to estimate how many African countries were part of the United Nations. Okay, so they asked them. But before they did that, they had a sneaky wheel of fortune that spin, and it had numbers from, I think, 0 to 100. So the wheel was 0 to 100. But the sneaky thing that they did was they designed Group A was, the wheel was kind of designed to land on 10, even though they thought it was random spin. They didn't see what other people were spinning. And Group B was designed to land on 65. Okay, so so they spun the wheel, and Group A had 10 and Group B had 65. And when the arrow stopped spinning, then they asked the person in the experiment to say if they believed the percentage was higher or lower than the number on the wheel. Okay. Now the wheel had nothing to do with the number of African countries that were members of the UN, but they found that people who landed on 10 in the first half of the experiment guessed around 25% of Africa, or the African countries, were part of the UN. And the people who landed on 65 said around 45%. So they were locked into place by the psychological phenomenon known as anchoring. So let's say we've got some guesses. So this is great. We've got, Andrew says 45 million. We've got Corey says, no idea. Michael says 35 million. Okay, that's a really good guess. All right. So the trick is no one really knew the answer, but they had to guess it. And when they were surveyed afterwards, all of them said that the wheel spinning had no impact at all on the number they guessed, but the results showed otherwise. All right. So here is the deal. The population of Peru is 32.5 million people. Now, you might say, well, I mean, this is not a full experiment. We just did this little fun thing. But you might say, well, that had no impact. When you said 50 million, it had no impact at all on my guess. And obviously, if you have educated, if you know something about the population of Peru, that's different, because then you're using different things. But if you have no idea, then the evidence is strong that a suggestion of 50 million people does affect your guess. And that's just something that we are pattern makers. We don't even recognize the anchors that are out there. They don't necessarily have to be related at all to the question at hand. So that's just an example of the anchoring bias. Okay, that's a long one, because this one is a really important one in business and in life, and you can see it in all kinds of things. If you deny it, you miss opportunities to make better decisions. If you think that other people are only susceptible, then you miss opportunities to make better decisions. So recognize it in ourselves. These are pattern makers that we as human beings are the recipients of this lovely pattern making device called our brains, and anchoring works. Okay, illusion of control is when we overestimate how much influence we have over others. So we think that we have more control over the outcome of a dice game, for example. If we if we buy the lottery ticket, we think that we have a better chance of winning the lottery than if someone else buys the lottery ticket. Actually, yes, Kathy says a really good thing. Like in polls. Polls use anchoring all the time, and this is why you have to be very careful about biases in polls if you're making decisions based on what the polls suggest. Very important. I mean, the biggest thing with biases is really to make better decisions. And so recognizing where it might be, recognizing when it might be working on you is probably more important than recognizing where it might be working on others. All right, so the illusion of control. So do you have any illusion of control? You might see that in superstitions. Like, if I do this, this will happen. This sense that we have more control. All right, availability heuristic. This is overestimating the likelihood of events that come easily to mind. And this is really, really, really powerful in today's, in where we see all these videos of everything. We see a plane crash and we think, oh, it must be much more dangerous to fly than it is before. The likelihood of plane crashes is a statistically higher event when evaluated in the minds of people who've just seen footage of a plane crash. And this goes for everything. Now, some people will say, no, this is not a thing. This thing actually happens more. This thing is actually happening more now. And that can be true too. Like, you can say that there are more, let's say, there are more trees falling after a big rain and a landslide. So the likelihood of a landslide is greater now because the earth is saturated. That can be true, but that doesn't negate the fact that we think that things are more frequent the more frequently and more easily they come to mind. So that is the availability heuristic. You can deny a lot of things, but it is there and we have it. All right, let's see. Okay, authority bias. We may have to cut some things short so we can play bingo, but authority bias is when we attribute a greater authority, or greater accuracy rather. We attribute greater accuracy to the opinion of an authority figure. So this isn't a fact in terms of the accuracy of the fact. It has to do with attributing the accuracy of the opinion to the authority figure. And it can be influenced by authority regardless of the relevancy of the content. So I'm not talking about, like Dr. Fauci talking about vaccine efficacies. I'm talking about Dr. Fauci talking about, the accuracy of baseball statistics. This person is an authority here, therefore their opinions hold more sway in a completely irrelevant area. All right. Or some might say this person's a great business person, so they're going to be a great politician. That kind of thing. Editorial board opinions, absolutely. But it has to do, exactly, and it's perfect, but it really has to do with applying authority. Like, if you are an authority in one area, seeing them as an authority in an irrelevant area. So that's an easier way to do it. False consensus bias is overestimating the degree that others agree with us. And this can also be that people who agree with us agree for all the same reasons, and people who disagree with us disagree for all the same reasons. So that's a false consensus bias. Oh, we all know that Susan is, a bad boss. Okay, you might think, and then the loudest speaker says Susan's a bad boss, and the people who are quiet don't say anything. So we think, they must agree with us. Beware of silence as a stand-in for agreement. All right. And the last one we'll probably have to do is the clustering illusion. And this is big. This is seeing patterns in random events. And this is what we do. We're humans. We see patterns in random events. And if they fit a story and a narrative that feels emotionally accurate to you, to us, then we might think that correlation is causation. So There is a book called Spurious Correlations. It's hilarious. I recommend it, but it talks about all of these correlations and causational kind of mistakes that we make. And it's very easy to do, and we all do it. All right. Kathy says, most people love me. That's true. Most people do love you. Exactly. Great example. But that's good because that's an example of you seeing the bias in yourself, which is the whole point. All right. Ready for some brain bug bingo? We've got about 5 minutes to play brain bug bingo. One more conservation bias is not revising our beliefs in the face of new evidence. You can see that that's related to confirmation bias, where we get new evidence and we ignore it because it doesn't conform. So we conserve our thoughts. Like we believed when we were, 25 years old that trickle-down economics is the best thing, and we fail to add evidence that pokes holes in what we thought. We conserve our point of view. So conservation bias is that. And that relates to the desire to be consistent. We don't want to be called a flip-flopper. People say, oh, people flip-flop, they change their minds. Well, the scientific method requires that you take more evidence, you use it to poke holes in your hypothesis to create better theories. All right. So being a flip-flopper can be a good thing if the evidence that you're seeking is reliable and relevant and the evidence that you're using. So you want to be a flip-flopper if the evidence suggests you should be a flip-flopper. Okay. Ready for the first? Okay. This is a brain bug. Oops, wrong side. This is our brain bug. See our little brain bug? Brain bug bingo. Ready? So all you have to do, and there's some tricks in here because not all of these are biases. Some tricks in here, and then I'll kind of tell you the answer. Let me know. Put it in the chat if you know which bias this is, or if there is a bias, a cognitive bias. Erica is a software engineer. She knows that creative types are far more likely to believe questionable science than engineers like her. Bias or no bias? Does anyone want to take a guess? Anyone want to take a guess? Erica's an engineer. She knows that the creative types are much more likely to believe questionable science. That is, there's a lot of biases in play here. This is certainly a biased position, but this is definitely a blind spot bias. Others are more biased than us. Others are more biased. They're more biased than we are. Others are more biased than I am. Blind spot bias. But it could be another bias too. So if you have another reason for another bias, chances are that's probably right as well. Okay, number 2. Ready? Put your answers. Bias. Good. Kathy says bias. Number 2, if you can know the bias or you get a hint at the bias, you get bonus points. Woo-hoo. All right. I know that if I make the right compelling case, there is no way my boss won't agree to double the funds for this project. Okay? Essentially, the little hint here is I control what my boss thinks. And if I presented it in the right way, I will change my boss's mind. There's no way that I can't change my boss's mind. That could be, drum roll, please. Anyone want to say before I say? Got to get it in the chat. Illusion of control. If you think that you can control what other people think, illusion of control. I know, Kathy. Exactly. It's hilarious. But these are all scenarios that I have actually seen in the wild, which is why they made it into our brain bug bingo. All right. We've got more biases in our brain bug bingo, but yes, Michael says bias. You're absolutely right. Yes, yes, yes. Okay, next one. Okay, this one I think is a dangerous one, and I think it's really important that we distinguish between two things, and I'm going to read this one. All right, Daniel doesn't need to get a second opinion about brain surgery because his surgeon, Dr. Hanks, graduated from Stanford Medical School at the top of his class and did his fellowship at Johns Hopkins. So Daniel doesn't need to get a second opinion. Does anyone want to take a stab? We know this is bias, right? Does anyone want to take a stab at what this is? What is this bias? Bonus points for identifying this bias. And this one is a very clear, but could have some other biases as well. These biases don't stand alone like as distinct things. It just means we're probably making some biased decisions. Why do you not need to get a second opinion? Because your surgeon graduated from Stanford Medical School and did his fellowship at Johns Hopkins. That is an example of authority bias. Now, what we said authority is that you use authority in one thing to attribute authority in another area, but I think Michael said it best. I'm going to give rubber chickens to Michael because he said, and I totally agree, dangerous bias. Okay, and that's the whole point. Like, even though this brain bug bingo identifies the biases, it's really more important to identify when there is a bias. And we've got, Jennifer says, authority bias. Kathy says, blind spot and authority. Yes, I think this is a perfect example of authority bias. And this is one where you should be aware of when someone has authority and when someone is an authority. And for example, because someone went to Stanford Medical School and did a fellowship at Johns Hopkins University does not necessarily, I mean, if they did that and they are, an optometrist, they may not be the best to do your heart surgery, for example. So you need to, or general surgeon, they may not be the best one to do your thyroid surgery, for example. Maybe you want an ENT surgeon. So that's kind of where you should always be looking at whether the authority bias is kind of making you not get a second opinion. All right, we'll do a couple more. Okay, here's one. Ready for this one? Ranjit prefers his idea. Margaret prefers her idea. And Darnell prefers Margaret's idea. Does anyone want to take a stab at this one? This is a hard one. Ranjit prefers his idea. Kathy, okay, you're going to crack me up. I'm going to pull that in. Ranjit prefers his idea. I'm seeing Kathy's comment and she's making me laugh. Margaret prefers her idea and Darnell prefers Margaret's idea. Does anyone want to take a stab at that? Okay, anyone take a stab at that? And this is what cracks me up. If you said Harvard, that would be different. Oh, yes, it would. That's a perfect example. Okay, Kathy, I love you. That's hilarious. All right. So here is where the danger is also, is when we see biases in everything. Now, this is really not bias. I mean, you can prefer your idea. You can prefer someone else's idea. That doesn't necessarily trigger that every single thing is indicative of some bias that you see in the wild. Like, you don't have to, it's not, playing brain bug bingo on a daily basis is not very good because you don't want to be like calling out biases. Sometimes I do that to my husband. He drives him crazy. All right. So that's really not a bias. I mean, you can agree with someone else. Now, if the reasons for agreement might unearth a bias. All right, we'll do one more. Let's see which one. Okay, here's a good one. I just read a report about the many people who have been run over in parking lots while looking at their phones. The likelihood of being run over in parking lots has gone up. Anyone want to take a stab at that? I just read a report about the many people who have been run over in parking lots while looking at their phones. The likelihood of getting run over in a parking lot has gone up. Anyone want to take a stab at that last one? Extra chickens. It always the delay while you guys are putting in your answers, because there will be people who are joining in after the live call, and be sure to participate after the live call. Although it's sometimes hard for me to know which thing you're answering, it's still fun to see your guesses at this brain bug bingo. And also, if you want to play another round of brain bug bingo later, we can do it again. There are so many biases. Okay. So Michael says bias. Jennifer says, I forget what it's called, but it's bias. And Tajbir says media bias. And, that's a good point, because I want to say that the media bias is a good guess, because whether you label it media bias or this or that is really not that important. It's really about recognizing the bias. And this is a bias in the media. Common sense bias, recency bias. They're all the right answer. I'm just in the example that I've given in the definitions that I've given in the common definitions. This would be considered the availability heuristic or the availability bias. And a lot of people will tell you, this really is happening more. It's not just the availability heuristic. And that can be true. Sometimes things happen more frequently than other things. I mean, certainly more people are killed in parking lots by reading their cell phone than they were in 1980. Does anyone know why? Yeah, because we didn't have cell phones in 1980. So obviously that kind of thing. But to deny the availability heuristic, or to not deny the existence of these biases, or to deny that you are subject to, or I'm going to say me, I am subject to these biases less than you, is a perfect example of the mindset that doesn't allow you to make better decisions. You have to engage. We need a list. Okay, so that's what happens. Kathy says we need a list. And that's where, if we're doing the workshop, if Applied Curiosity Lab is doing the workshop, you've got a list you can check. It's like a bingo card, and you've got little things, but this is just like a fun way of kind of playing it a little bit. You're absolutely right. It's like without a list, it's really ridiculously hard. All right, 3 things you can do, and then we'll wrap it up. So one is to practice identifying biases in your own thinking before you start identifying biases in others. So if you say, that person is biased, stop yourself, because it's really important to, it's not important for you to necessarily help them make better decisions before you and your brain are honed for how to think to make better decisions for yourself. So it's kind of like put on your own oxygen mask on the airplane before securing the oxygen mask of other people. All right. So that's number 1. Number 2, disconfirmation. Always look for it. And also, don't look for disconfirmation given by people who agree with you, explaining the opposite side of an argument. You go look for what the people who disagree with you, or the information that disconfirms what you believe, is saying, and look for reliable, relevant evidence. Always look for disconfirming evidence. Okay. Number 3, always find an element of luck, because between every decision and every outcome is always an element of luck. Good thinkers know this. Okay, rubber chickens. All right, one more. You're going to get all the rubber chickens. We got so many good thinkers. Everyone's going to get rubber chickens who participated. So you have 1 more minute to participate. And then the last thing is think about counterfactuals. There is one thing that could have been different, that my decision or my assumption or my determination would have been different. So for example, if that person coming at me with an axe was wearing a forestry uniform, it would be different than if they were wearing like a jail uniform. One kind of counterfactual. Always look for a counterfactual. All right. So those are really the key things. Be sure, as you're focusing on your biases, focus on your own. Don't need to focus on other people. Secure your oxygen mask, rubber chicken flying, and we'll see you next Monday. If you have any topics that you want good thinking to cover in the realm of not what to think, but how to think, because we need this little bit of time to improve how we think, let me know. We're here most Mondays right here on LinkedIn Live and on YouTube Live, and after on Becky Saltzman. You can subscribe, hit that bell for notifications. Have a great week. Thank you, good thinkers. This was really fun.